Hello, my name is Megan, and I want to share my journey of how I learned to speak English naturally. English stopped feeling like a subject in school and started feeling like a part of my life. When I stopped worrying about perfect grammar, I finally started speaking with confidence. When I first started learning English, everything I said had to pass through a long, confusing tunnel in my brain. I would hear a word in English, then immediately translate it into my own language, think about the answer in that language, and then try to translate my answer back into English. By the time I opened my mouth, the moment had already passed, and people were moving on to a new topic. I can still remember the frustration. My classmates or coworkers would laugh and respond quickly, but I sat there trying to catch up, stuck in my own head. It felt like I was always 2 steps behind. I wanted to join in, I wanted to sound natural, but instead I sounded like a slow machine that needed extra time to process. I knew something had to change. The turning point came one afternoon at a coffee shop. I was waiting in line, and the barista asked the woman in front of me, "What can I get started for you today?" That sentence hit me like lightning. In my head, I broke it apart. What can I get started for you today? I translated every piece into my language, then reconstructed it in English. But by the time I figured it out, the woman already had her latte in hand. That's when it hit me. English wasn't supposed to be solved like a math problem. It was supposed to flow naturally, like a song, like breathing. From that day, I decided I had to stop translating in my head. It wasn't easy. It felt like breaking a habit I'd carried my whole life. At first, I would literally whisper to myself the English words I already knew for simple objects around me. If I saw a table, I didn't let myself think of it in my old language. I said table. When I grabbed my keys, I thought keys. When I poured coffee, I thought coffee. It felt childish at first, almost like learning how to talk all over again. But slowly, my brain started reaching for English before it reached for my old language. One of the hardest challenges came when I had to describe my feelings. Vocabulary for objects was simple: chair, book, phone, but emotions were tricky. I used to think in my old language, "I'm worried," or "I'm excited," and then scramble to find the English word. But I forced myself to stay in English. If I felt nervous before a meeting, I told myself in English, "I'm nervous." If I felt happy after a walk, I whispered, "I feel good." Those small sentences became anchors for me. Over time, they grew into bigger sentences and even short conversations in my head. The real test came at work. One afternoon, my manager asked me a question during a team meeting. Normally, I would freeze because my brain wanted to translate everything. But this time, I took a deep breath and told myself, "Don't translate. Just say it in English the way you're thinking it." The sentence wasn't perfect. My grammar slipped a little, but everyone understood me. And for the first time, I felt free. I wasn't trapped by my old language anymore. I was actually speaking English, not translating it. I won't lie, it wasn't a quick change. There were days I fell back into the old habit. Sometimes when I was tired, I'd catch myself silently translating again. But I stayed patient with myself. Every time I noticed, I reminded myself, "No translation, Megan. Just think in English." And little by little, it worked. I remember the first time I woke up in the morning and the first thought in my head was in English. I smiled so big that day because it meant my brain was finally learning to live in English, not just borrow it. This step, stopping the constant translation, was the foundation for everything else that followed. Once I let go of that habit, English started to feel less like homework and more like part of my life. My confidence grew, my sentences came out faster, and my conversations flowed more naturally. I no longer felt like a robot repeating memorized lines. I felt like myself, expressing my real thoughts, just in a different language. And here's the beautiful part. When I stopped translating, I started hearing English differently. Instead of breaking it down word by word, I noticed the rhythm, the way people connected sounds, the music in their speech. That realization opened the door to the next stage of my journey. After I stopped translating in my head, something inside me shifted. For the first time, I wasn't treating English like a math problem with rules to solve. Instead, I started to see it as a living language, something people use to connect, laugh, share, and build relationships. And that realization led me to a new question. How do children learn a language? They don't memorize grammar rules or carry a dictionary everywhere. They listen. They listen all the time. They hear their parents, their friends, the TV in the background, even strangers talking in the grocery store. Their brains soak up the sounds, the rhythm, and the patterns until the words become part of them. That's exactly what I wanted for myself. I wanted to train my brain to listen the way a child listens, not to understand every single word, but to feel the music of English. So I made a commitment. I would surround myself with English as much as possible. I started small. I switched my phone and laptop to English. At first, it was annoying because I had to guess what some settings meant. But after a week or two, it became normal, and I realized I had picked up words I never studied, like settings, notifications, and reminders. Then I moved on to listening for fun. Instead of listening to music in my own language, I created playlists of English songs. At first, I only caught a few words: love, baby, night, home. But I didn't stress. I let the music wash over me, repeating the songs again and again. Just like a child does when they want to hear their favorite lullaby or cartoon theme song over and over. After weeks of listening, I noticed I could sing along to parts without even thinking. That gave me a strange but powerful feeling. I was living the language, not forcing it. One of the best things I did was start watching American TV shows without subtitles. That was hard, painfully hard, at the beginning. I remember watching an episode of Friends, and I could only catch maybe 30% of the words. But I kept watching. I paid attention to the characters' faces, their body language, the way their voices rose and fell. Slowly, the words began to stick. For example, every time Joey said, "How you doing?" I laughed, and then I realized I had learned an expression I could actually use in real life. I wasn't just studying English, I was absorbing it the way kids do when they watch cartoons. I also started listening to podcasts during my commute to work. At first, it felt like listening to noise. I could catch a word here and there: Monday, coffee, meeting, but the rest flew by too fast. The old me would have panicked, grabbed a dictionary, and paused every 5 seconds to translate. But now I reminded myself, Megan, just listen like a child. Kids don't understand every word, but they still learn. So I let the words play in the background while I drove. Amazingly, after a few months, my brain started picking up more and more without effort. Phrases like, "you know what I mean," at the end of the day, and "kind of like," became so familiar that I found myself saying them without planning. Listening also helped me understand the music of English. In my old language, sentences had a different rhythm. But when I listened to Americans talk, I noticed how they connected words together. Instead of saying, "What are you doing?" slowly and clearly, I heard, "What ya doing?" At first, it confused me. I thought, that doesn't match the grammar I learned in class. But then I realized that's exactly how people really speak. And if I wanted to sound natural, I had to copy those rhythms, not the stiff grammar book sentences. The more I listened, the more confident I became in conversations. For example, one day at the grocery store, I heard a mom telling her son, "Hold on a sec." I'd never studied that phrase in class, but because I had heard similar phrases so many times, I instantly understood it meant, "Wait a moment." A week later, when a coworker asked me for help while I was busy, I smiled and said, "Hold on a sec." The words came out naturally, without me memorizing them. That was the power of listening like a child. It allowed me to collect real-life expressions without effort. I also noticed that listening changed the way I felt about my mistakes. Before, if I didn't understand someone, I panicked. I thought they would judge me or get frustrated. But after months of practicing listening, I realized that even native speakers don't catch every word. Sometimes they ask, "Sorry, what was that?" or "Can you repeat that?" I saw that in movies, I heard it in coffee shops, and I even noticed it at work. That gave me comfort. If Americans themselves repeat or clarify, then I didn't have to be perfect. I just had to stay calm and keep listening. One unforgettable moment happened at a bus stop. A man next to me started talking about the weather. Normally, I would freeze and try to translate his words. But this time, I focused on his tone, his gestures, and the key words, rain, weekend, hope. I put the pieces together and realized he was saying he hoped it wouldn't rain over the weekend. Without thinking, I replied, "Yeah, I hope it stays sunny." He nodded, smiled, and we had a tiny, natural conversation. That was the moment I knew my listening practice was working. I could understand and respond without translating. Looking back, I think listening like a child was one of the most powerful steps in my journey. It taught me patience, it taught me rhythm, and it gave me real expressions I could use every day. But most importantly, it prepared me for the next step, actually opening my mouth and practicing with real people. Because the more I listened, the more I realized that I couldn't just be a quiet observer forever. I needed to take all those rhythms, all those phrases, and actually use them in real conversations. And that's exactly what I did next. After all those months of training myself to stop translating in my head and listening like a child, I began to notice something. English wasn't just living inside my head anymore. It was starting to feel alive in the world around me. I could hear it in songs, catch phrases in TV shows, and even understand little conversations between strangers at the grocery store. But deep down, I knew that listening alone wasn't enough. I couldn't just sit quietly in the background, absorbing the sounds. If I wanted to speak English naturally, I had to step out of my comfort zone and actually practice with real people. That thought was both exciting and terrifying. You see, listening is safe. Nobody judges you when you're just listening. You can replay a podcast 100 times and no one will know. But speaking is different. Speaking means putting yourself out there, making mistakes in public, and risking embarrassment. I knew this, and it scared me. For a long time, I convinced myself that I wasn't ready. I told myself, "You'll speak when your English is better." But the truth is, my English wasn't going to get better unless I spoke. It was like standing at the edge of a swimming pool, waiting for the right moment to jump in. There's no perfect moment. You just have to jump. So I started small. My first challenge was at the coffee shop near my office. Normally, I ordered the same thing every morning, black coffee. I didn't need to say much, just one black coffee, please. But one morning, I pushed myself to say something extra. When the barista asked, "How's your day going?" instead of just nodding or saying, "Good," I took a deep breath and said, "It's going well. I have a busy morning, but I'm excited for the weekend." It wasn't perfect. My voice shook a little and I stumbled on, excited. But you know what? The barista smiled, nodded, and replied, "Yeah, same here." That tiny exchange gave me more confidence than 100 grammar exercises ever could. Encouraged, I started practicing with my coworkers. At first, I stuck to safe topics like the weather, lunch, or weekend plans. I would say, "It's really hot today," or "Did you try the new restaurant across the street?" These were simple sentences, but they opened doors. One day, a coworker mentioned her dog, and instead of just smiling politely, I asked, "What kind of dog do you have?" She lit up, started telling me stories about her Labrador, and before I knew it, we were laughing together. That was the first time I felt like English wasn't separating me from people, it was connecting me to them. But of course, not every moment was smooth. There were plenty of awkward situations. Once, I tried to tell a joke in English at lunch, and I messed up the punchline so badly that no one laughed. My face turned red, and I wanted to crawl under the table. For a moment, I thought, this is why you should just stay quiet. But then, one of my coworkers smiled and said, "Don't worry, Megan, we get what you mean." They weren't laughing at the joke, but they weren't laughing at me either. They appreciated the effort. That moment taught me an important lesson. Making mistakes doesn't end the world. In fact, mistakes are proof that I'm learning. I also began practicing outside of work. I joined a local book club at the library. The first meeting was overwhelming. Everyone spoke so fast, sharing their opinions about the novel. I barely kept up. But when the group leader turned to me and asked, "What did you think of the main character?" I had two choices, freeze up or try. I took a deep breath and said, "I think she was strong, but sometimes too stubborn." It was short, maybe too simple, but it was my real opinion in English. The group nodded, and someone even said, "Good point." Walking home that night, I felt 10 feet tall. The more I practiced, the more I realized that real-life conversations gave me something textbooks never could, the ability to think on my feet. In class, I always had time to plan my answers. But in real life, conversations moved fast. If I wanted to keep up, I had to react quickly. At first, it was scary, but over time, it became exciting, like a game. I started to notice patterns in conversations. When someone said, "How's it going?" I learned to answer, "Pretty good. How about you?" When someone said, "Thanks," I quickly replied, "No problem," or "Anytime." These little exchanges became second nature, and I realized I was starting to sound less like a student and more like myself. One of the most surprising places I practiced was at the gym. At first, I went just to work out, but soon I realized it was also a great place to practice English. People at the gym are friendly and conversations are short, which made it less intimidating. A simple, "How many sets do you have left?" or "Do you want to work in?" became opportunities to interact. One time, a trainer corrected my form and gave me tips. I listened carefully, asked a few questions, and by the end, we were chatting about workout routines. That conversation stuck with me because it wasn't forced, it was natural, just like the English I wanted to speak. Of course, practicing with real people also meant dealing with moments of misunderstanding. Sometimes I said something, and the other person looked confused. My old self would have panicked, but now I learned to stay calm. I would rephrase my sentence or use gestures. Most of the time, people figured it out. And the more I did this, the less scared I became. I realized that communication isn't about perfect words, it's about connecting. As long as I stayed open and willing, people met me halfway. Looking back, I think the biggest lesson I learned from practicing with real people was courage. It wasn't about having perfect grammar or the biggest vocabulary. It was about having the courage to speak up, to be vulnerable, to show up as myself even when I stumbled. Every conversation, no matter how small, built a brick in the bridge between me and the natural English I was chasing. And something beautiful started happening. The more I practiced, the more I noticed the little phrases people used every day, those expressions that made their speech sound so natural. Instead of always saying, "I'm very tired," I heard people say, "I'm beat." Instead of, "I don't know," they said, "I have no clue." My ears started picking up on these phrases, and I realized, if I wanted to sound natural, I needed to use them too. That realization led me to the next step of my journey, learning to use everyday expressions just like Americans do. By the time I started practicing with real people, I noticed something fascinating. No matter how much grammar I studied, no matter how carefully I built sentences, I still sounded different from everyone else. I was understandable, yes, but not natural. My coworkers, neighbors, and even strangers at the gym spoke with a rhythm and style that textbooks never taught me. They used expressions that didn't always make literal sense, but somehow everyone knew what they meant. And I realized that if I wanted to fit in, not just speak English, but speak English naturally, I had to start learning the language people actually used in their daily lives. I still remember the first expression that really stuck with me. One afternoon, after a long morning at work, my coworker sighed and said, "I'm beat." At first, I was confused. I knew beat as a verb, like beat the eggs or beat someone in a game. But she didn't look like she was cooking or competing, she looked tired. Then it clicked. "I'm beat" meant I'm very tired. That tiny discovery changed the way I looked at English. It was like finding a secret code. Suddenly, I wanted to collect more of these expressions because they were the keys to sounding less like a textbook and more like myself. So I started paying attention. Every conversation became a classroom. When someone at the office said, "That meeting was a piece of cake," I didn't picture dessert anymore. I understood it meant it was easy. When a friend texted, "I'm down," I realized she wasn't sad. She was agreeing to join our plan. These phrases were everywhere, hidden in plain sight, and the more I listened, the more I wanted to use them. At first, I was nervous to try them myself. What if I used them in the wrong situation? What if people laughed at me? But then I remembered how practicing with real people had taught me that mistakes don't end the world. So one Friday evening, when a coworker asked if I wanted to grab a drink after work, I smiled and said, "Yeah, I'm down." For a split second, I waited for a strange reaction. But instead, she just nodded like it was the most normal thing in the world. That was the moment I knew I was on the right track. The more I practiced, the more natural it felt. Instead of saying, "I don't understand," I would say, "I have no clue." Instead of, "I'm very hungry," I'd say, "I'm starving." And instead of, "I will call you later," I tried, "I'll hit you up." These phrases rolled off my tongue like I'd been using them forever. What surprised me most was how people responded. Their faces lit up. They smiled wider, laughed more, and seemed to feel more connected to me. It was as if speaking their language, the real language, not the classroom version, made me part of the group. Of course, there were times I messed up. Once, I tried to say "break a leg" to a coworker before her big presentation, but I forgot the exact phrase and ended up saying, "Go break your leg." Everyone laughed, including me, and she kindly explained the difference. Instead of feeling embarrassed, I felt proud. I had tried. And because I laughed with them, they laughed with me, not at me. That mistake actually helped me remember the expression forever. Another turning point came when I joined a weekly volunteer group at the local community center. The people there used so many everyday expressions that at first, I felt lost again. I heard phrases like, hang in there, no worries, and you nailed it. But instead of panicking, I listened carefully and wrote them down in a small notebook I carried everywhere. At home, I practiced using them in sentences, and the next week, I would test them out in conversations. I can still remember the first time I used hang in there. A friend told me she was stressed about her exams, and I said, hang in there, you'll be fine. Her smile told me I'd used it perfectly. That feeling of connection was priceless. Using everyday expressions also made me realize how much culture and language are tied together. For example, Americans often say, catch you later, instead of goodbye. At first, it sounded strange to me. Why catch? But the more I used it, the more natural it became. It wasn't just words, it was a way of sharing friendliness, of showing casual warmth. Learning these expressions helped me understand American culture on a deeper level. It wasn't about memorizing, it was about living. I also practiced by keeping a phrase journal. Every time I heard a new expression at work, in a TV show, or even in a podcast, I wrote it down. At night before bed, I read through the list and tried saying the phrases out loud. I even talked to myself in the mirror, practicing lines like, that's awesome, no big deal, and I totally get it. At first, it felt silly, but when those phrases started popping out of my mouth naturally in real conversations, I knew it was worth it. And something interesting happened. The more I used these expressions, the less I worried about grammar. I used to freeze thinking, is this verb in the right tense? But once I had a pocket full of ready-made phrases, I stopped overthinking. I had tools I could pull out instantly, without pausing to translate or calculate. It gave me freedom to focus on connecting with people instead of obsessing over mistakes. I'll never forget the day my coworker told me, wow, Megan, your English sounds so natural now. It wasn't because I had mastered complicated grammar. It was because I'd started using the little expressions that made conversations flow. That compliment felt like a gold medal. For years, I had chased perfect English, but what really mattered was natural English. The more I embraced expressions, the more English blended into my daily life. At the grocery store, when the cashier said, "Have a good one," I didn't pause anymore. I responded, "Thanks, you too." When my friend asked if I wanted to go hiking, I didn't say, "Yes, that sounds enjoyable." I said, "Sure, I'm in." And when I was tired after a long day, instead of saying, "I want to rest," I sighed and said, "I'm wiped out." Every phrase I used brought me closer to sounding like the people around me, closer to feeling like English wasn't something I studied, but something I lived. But this step also taught me something deeper. Learning everyday expressions wasn't just about sounding fluent, it was about belonging. Each phrase I mastered was like a key that unlocked a new door into the culture around me. Every time I said, "No worries," or "You got this," I felt a little more connected to the community, a little more like I belonged here. By this point, English had stopped being a subject for me. It wasn't something I practiced only during study time. It was part of my conversations, my jokes, my texts, my daily life. And the more it blended in, the more it became part of me. That realization set the stage for the final step of my journey, making English not just something I practiced, but something I lived every single day. By the time I had started using everyday expressions, English was no longer just a language I was learning, it was becoming something I lived through. At first, I used those expressions carefully, like trying on new clothes to see if they fit. But the more I practiced, the more natural they felt. I began to notice that English was seeping into every corner of my life, and I realized that this was the final key to speaking naturally. I had to make English a part of who I was, not just something I practiced in short sessions. The change started in small ways. For example, I switched the language of my social media accounts to English. At first, it was confusing to read phrases like add to your story, share post, or suggested for you. But instead of switching back to my old language, I forced myself to get used to it. Over time, these little interactions trained me to think in English without effort. I didn't even notice it happening. One day, I opened my phone and realized that every single app, Facebook, Instagram, even the weather app, was in English, and I wasn't struggling anymore. That was the first sign that English wasn't something extra in my life. It was becoming the default. Another step I took was journaling in English. Every night before bed, I opened a notebook and wrote a few sentences about my day. At first, my entries were short and simple. Today was busy. I am tired. I cooked dinner. But as the weeks went by, my sentences grew longer. I started to describe my feelings, my thoughts, my goals. Writing in English helped me discover a voice I didn't know I had. I could see my progress on paper, and it motivated me to keep going. Sometimes, when I was upset or stressed, I poured my feelings into English words. It became my private space, a way to connect with myself while also strengthening my new language. I also made English part of my entertainment. Instead of watching movies in my native language, I switched to American shows and films. At first, I needed subtitles, but I challenged myself to watch without them. I remember binge-watching The Office and laughing out loud at the jokes. That was a turning point because humor is one of the hardest things to understand in another language. But the more I watched, the more I picked up on sarcasm, tone, and cultural references. Soon, I didn't just understand the jokes. I repeated them with my friends, and they laughed along. That was when I realized I wasn't just learning English anymore. I was living it. Music was another big part of this transformation. I created playlists of my favorite American songs and memorized the lyrics. I sang along in the car, in the shower, even while cooking. Sometimes I didn't understand every line at first, but singing helped me feel the rhythm and intonation of English. It was like training my mouth and ears at the same time. One day, while humming along to a song, I caught myself saying, "This song is stuck in my head." That was a phrase I had picked up directly from the lyrics. It hit me. I wasn't studying anymore. I was absorbing the language without even trying. At work, I also made English part of my professional life. Instead of writing notes or reminders in my old language, I wrote them in English. I drafted emails in English, double-checked them, and sent them out with growing confidence. I even started volunteering to give small updates in meetings. At first, my voice shook, and I felt nervous. But every time I spoke up, I got a little stronger. Eventually, my coworkers began asking me questions directly, knowing I could respond. That trust meant the world to me. It showed that my English wasn't just passable, it was good enough for real communication. One of the biggest changes came in my personal relationships. Some of my friends in the US only spoke English, so I had no choice but to use it. But instead of treating those conversations like practice sessions, I embraced them as real connections. We talked about movies, food, and weekend plans. We joked, argued, and comforted each other in English. I realized that friendships weren't built on perfect grammar. They were built on laughter, shared experiences, and trust. And English was the bridge that made those relationships possible. I also began thinking in English more consistently. This was something I had worked on earlier, but now it became second nature. When I was cooking, I thought, I need to add salt. When I was driving, I thought, the traffic is crazy today. Even when I was daydreaming, my inner voice used English. At first, it felt strange, almost like I was borrowing someone else's voice. But over time, it became my voice. That was one of the most powerful feelings of all, realizing that English was no longer foreign to me. It was mine. Making English part of my life also meant being brave in everyday situations. I remember going to the doctor's office and explaining my symptoms in English. It wasn't easy, I didn't know all the medical terms, but I managed. I remember asking for directions when I got lost downtown, and even though I stumbled, the stranger understood me and kindly helped. These small victories added up, showing me that I didn't need perfect words to live my life in English. I just needed the courage to keep going. What surprised me most was how English even entered my dreams. The first time I dreamed in English, I woke up smiling. It wasn't a complicated dream. I was just talking to a friend about going to the movies, but the fact that my brain had chosen English on its own meant that the language had become part of my subconscious. It was no longer something I forced myself to do. It was something I was living, even in my sleep. There were still challenges, of course. Sometimes I felt tired of constantly thinking and speaking in English. Sometimes I longed for the comfort of my native language. But every time I pushed through, I reminded myself of why I started. I wanted freedom. I wanted connection. I wanted to be able to express myself anywhere with anyone. And every step I took, every phrase I learned, every conversation I had brought me closer to that dream. Over time, I realized that English had stopped being a goal. It had become part of my identity. I wasn't Megan who is learning English anymore. I was just Megan, living her life, speaking naturally, making friends, laughing at jokes, singing along to songs, and building her future in English. And that transformation didn't happen overnight. It happened because I stopped translating in my head. I listened like a child. I practiced with real people. I learned everyday expressions, and finally, I made English part of my life. This last step didn't feel like a finish line. It felt like the beginning of something even bigger. Because once English became part of my daily routine, I stopped worrying about being perfect. I started focusing on living, on growing, and on connecting with people. That was the moment I truly understood. Learning English wasn't about reaching some final destination. It was about building a life where the language became as natural as breathing. When I look back at my journey, I realize it wasn't about memorizing grammar rules or forcing myself to speak perfectly. It was about letting English become part of me. At first, I struggled with translating in my head, and it made me feel stuck. But once I stopped doing that and allowed myself to think in English, everything changed. Then, by listening like a child, I discovered the beauty of how natural English really sounds in everyday life. From there, I stepped out of my comfort zone and practiced with real people, at work, in coffee shops, even with strangers who turned into friends. Every conversation gave me more confidence and more joy. Using everyday expressions was another turning point for me. It made me feel like I wasn't just learning a language, but living it. I started sounding less like a textbook and more like myself. And when English became part of my daily life, my thoughts, my writing, my dreams, that's when I realized I had finally reached the place I always wanted to be. Now, I don't worry about sounding perfect. I don't stress about every little mistake. Instead, I focus on connection, confidence, and natural flow. That's what speaking English naturally means to me. It's not about being flawless. It's about being real, being present, and being understood. So, if you're on the same journey, remember this. You don't have to rush, you don't have to be perfect, and you don't have to do it all at once. Let English slowly become part of your life. Think in it, listen to it, practice it, play with expressions, and live with it day by day. One day, just like me, you'll realize you're no longer just learning English. You're living it.